Hello everybody, welcome back to another one. We're going to do today When Worlds Collide, talking about when Europeans and Africans first start getting across the Atlantic, arriving in the Americas. What happens? How do the Americas react to these new people, to these new presence? What about the people that are in the Americas? How does this play out? What goes on? Some of this you probably already know, or some of this you know from sort of like foundational stories for the US and other things like that. But let's get into it a little bit more. There's a lot of complex, cool stuff happening, so we'll check it out. First, we're going to look at what happens when worlds collide. What are the sort of initial conquests like, or interactions like? Then we'll look at the new microbial unification of the world, which sounds really funky, but basically it just means what happens when everything from Afroeurasia goes to the Americas and everything from the Americas goes to Afroeurasia. A whole new world is bound together from the microbial level up to us. Then we'll look at new foods, new cultures, new people, all the sort of stuff that emerges from these interactions in lots of complex, strange ways. So the first sort of aspect of this is the collision. This is not a peaceful process. It's not a calm, smooth process. A lot of this process is deeply violent. As I said earlier, people in Afro-Eurasia did not expect to find a brand new continent filled with people they've never heard about. They didn't know what was there. People in the Americas had no idea that there were like people from some other land were going to show up to attack them or take their things or try to, colonize their space. So there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of misunderstandings that go on. The first sort of wave we might look at are the Spanish conquests. Some of these you might be familiar with more than others. We already looked a little bit at Columbus, right? I'm sure you all know the song, 1492. There's Columbus in the Caribbean. But as we looked at before, he makes 4 trips total, back and forth, kind of all over the Caribbean and back to Europe, sometimes actually taking native peoples with him and stuff like this. The first peoples that he encountered were the Taino people. That's not who's pictured here. People pictured here are Aztecs. The Taino people, we don't have any real good drawings of them from the time or anything. What we have is stories and stuff that's left over. By and large, Taino society is completely wiped out by the Spanish. One of the first places the Spanish land comes to be called Hispaniola. This is today Cuba, right? This area. And the Caribbean is filled with people when the Spanish first show up. They're a distinct cultural and sort of ethnic group. We don't really know a ton about them. Some people in Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands claim sort of ancestry from the Tainos, but it's really unclear. But some of their language actually survives. Words like barbecue, that was a Taino word, hurricane, hammock, stuff like this actually made it into Spanish and then made it into the English language. And the reason these people disappear so quickly is largely because the Spanish either kill them or work them to death, or they flee the Spanish and go to other places in South America and then sort of have cultural transformation. Also, as we're going to see later, disease plays a huge role in that. In particular, the Spanish engaged in this system they called encomienda, which is kind of weird. Basically, Spanish explorers were granted land, and they owned all the people that happened to live on that land. So when they were granted land in the Caribbean and there were people living on that land, those people were sort of bound to the person who controlled the land and were used essentially as slave labor under very, very harsh conditions, particularly in Cuba and places that are going to be in the future, like Dominican Republic and stuff like this. We'll see. So that's sort of the initial Spanish contact. It sets a precedent for how Europeans are going to interact with native peoples. From there, from the Caribbean, the Spanish are going to hear a rumor that there are large civilizations inland in places like Mexico and the north of South America today, like what's Belize and this sort of area. So Spanish adventurers are going to want to go there too. In particular, they're looking for gold. They're not really going to find very much gold, but they do end up finding a lot of silver later. And one of these people you might know of, Hernan Cortez, he's featured in lots of movies and books, and he ends up in history classes and stuff pretty regularly because him and a group of not very many Spanish, a few hundred, are going to attack the giant civilization that the Aztecs have built recently and are going to basically destroy Aztec society relatively quickly within a few years. They don't do this all on their own. They get a lot of help from other Native American groups. As it turns out, Aztec empire was fairly new, and the way that they ruled was kind of through fear with their neighbors, and a lot of their neighbors were very willing to help destroy them. But one of the just amazing things the Spanish note, and that we have some good archaeological evidence for and lots of writing about, is about the main city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan. Here's a drawing of it. It was a giant lake city. There was a Mexican sort of myth that they would develop a new city when they saw an eagle with a snake in its mouth land on a cactus. And as it turns out, this group of people saw this happen on a sort of landmass in the middle of a lake. That's where they went to build. And the city developed in the middle of the lake. It's awesome for defenses. There were bridges that could be raised and lowered or turned sideways. So typically it was thought of as this incredibly stronghold sort of city. The Spanish were absolutely amazed by it. They drew it. They wrote about it. They couldn't believe that there was this incredible city like Venice, all built out in the water in the Americas. It completely blew their mind. And that had a leader, Moctezuma, which often gets translated or sort of said as Montezuma, if you've heard that. He was the king, and actually it's probably more like a title. There were lots of different Montezumas or Motecazumas. And Cortez basically demanded the city surrender to the Spanish. It wasn't going to happen. Over a couple of years, he slowly attacks Aztec positions, and he gets a large following of other native Mexican folk to help attack the Aztec. In particular, one lady, Malinche, that's this lady here. Hold on, I'll draw her for you. This lady here, right? Serves as a translator. None of these Spanish folks could talk to the Aztecs. They couldn't talk to other indigenous groups. So they relied on this lady to help them. She has a really mixed legacy in Mexico today. She's often seen as kind of like a traitor to the Mexican people. But the problem with that is she was a Mexican person, right? And there were lots of Mexican people that didn't like the Aztecs at all. So it's really tricky. Your book talks about her a little bit more. You can definitely check that out. But pretty quickly, the city's going to fall. Cortez gets kind of lucky. They have a lot of things that the Mexicans don't. They have guns. They have steel weapons. They have horses. So they definitely have some technological advances, an advantage. However, that really isn't the main thing. The main thing is as the city comes under siege, a giant round of smallpox and other diseases sweeps through the city and just decimates the Aztec population. This really allows Cortez to take advantage of that situation in a way that he might not have been able to do otherwise. Also, there's some truth, at least at first, to the idea that the Aztecs thought maybe Cortez and his men were deities from some other realm. That played a role, but not as big as it's often sort of hyped up. Regardless, this again set an example for how the Spanish would invade local places, how they saw their role in terms of getting resources. As soon as they conquer the city, they strip all the precious metal and feathers and everything else out of it they can. And if you're a Spanish explorer, this looks really cool to you, right? Like all I need to do is find another big city and sack it, and I'll be rich forever, right? So other people are going to try that. Here's one of them, Francisco Pizarro. he is going to invade another giant empire in the Americas and topple it really quickly, almost by accident. He's not really popular, he's not really that well known, but he hears a rumor about this giant empire down in what today is Peru and Chile, like this area, mostly Peru, right? The western coast where the Incas are. And when he shows up, he has this idea of maybe sort of taking over the Incas or maybe engaging in some sort of military conflict, maybe trade deal. He's not sure. When he gets there, he finds out that there's a struggle for power, and it's unclear who's going to be in charge of the empire. The empire is sort of just forming, and there's no clear path to secession. So Pizarro is going to interject himself into that and sort of play each side off of each other. When one side wins, they're supposed to have Pizarro's allegiance, but they don't. He kills the sort of winner of the civil war, the sort of civil conflict anyway, and it just topples the whole empire. Really quickly, this small force of Spanish sort of stumble into this giant section of new empire. And what were they doing all this stuff for? There is some truth to the fact that they were interested in spreading Christianity, although I'm not sure how slaughtering people really does that. But also they were looking for resources. They were looking for land. Remember, the Pope had divided the world, essentially, and the Spanish had half and the Portuguese had half. And the Portuguese were getting spices and trade with India and Southeast Asia, so the Spanish felt like they wanted to get something out of this as well. And that's a big part of how this works. And the main thing we're going to find a couple lectures from now, we'll see that the Spanish come to get out of a lot of this is silver. There's not a whole lot of gold in the Americas for them to pilfer, but there's plenty of silver. So we'll get to that later. A different story sort of emerges in Brazil. And maybe you guys know this if you've been to Brazil, if you're from Brazil, or if you know about the difference between Hispanic or Latin American or any of these sorts of things. In Brazil, Brazil today is a giant country, and they speak Portuguese. Some Caribbean islands, right, there's still lots of population that speak Portuguese as well. Because when the Pope divided the world, they weren't quite sure of how the map would work, and this chunk of South America happened to be on the Portuguese side. So this is going to be Brazil in the future. It's named after actually a type of wood that the Portuguese found to be really lucrative to export from there. So that Treaty of Tordesillas, right, was where the Pope divided the world. But unlike the Spanish, the Portuguese didn't send one mission. They didn't send one group of colonizers. They didn't have a state-sponsored plan for Brazil. It's not one singular conquest. It's lots of different little conquests over time. It's lots of independent Portuguese. It's lots of sort of expat Portuguese, right, going across the Atlantic to try and like make their fortune. And they don't really get inland as much. Brazil is really dense jungles, right? Going up the Amazon would have been extremely difficult, extremely foreign to them. So most of the Brazilian cities and towns are going to form along the coast at first, these sort of outposts. And what is it the Brazilians are going to do there? Well, they're going to, or the Portuguese in Brazil, they're going to cut down big chunks of forest and grow sugar. There's not necessarily a lot of resources like silver they can pull out right away, but there is a new growing sort of global economy for products like sugar. Remember we talked about if you have a really big ship, you can move stuff that you couldn't move before because it might have been just really heavy. Sugar is one of those things. Sugar is pretty heavy. It's valuable, but if you can load a giant ship full of sugar, you can make tons and tons of money. So the Portuguese are going to open up these sorts of plantations that they call, or come to be called engenho, which is just engine. They're named after these sorts of machines. They're not industrial, they're not mechanized, they're not running on oil, none of that stuff yet. But they're basically like gears, right? Like a lot of water gears, stuff like that, that crush sugar. If you've ever seen it, we'll see some more of it in just a minute. Sugar grows in these really big, tall stalks that are pretty thick. They kind of look like bamboo. And to get sugar out of it, what you do is you run them through a machine that crushes the stalk. And as you just, grind up that stalk, a lot of liquid comes out. You take that liquid, you dry it out. There's your sugar. But this is really, really labor intensive, as we're going to see next time when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade. You need lots of people. Harvesting sugar is really hard. It's really nasty work. And there just weren't that many Portuguese there. So they're going to bring Africans, particularly from West Africa, with them to work as slave labor on these sorts of plantations growing sugar. And that's going to be the start of a really big sort of global system exchanging slaves and sugar that we'll look at more next time. It's not going to be relegated to just Brazil. We'll see it's kind of all over. Unlike South America, settlements in North America are going to be pretty different. The settlement's going to happen later. So whereas after Columbus's voyage in 1490s, by 1500, there are Spanish and Portuguese people headed to Central America and South America, the Caribbean, right away. Settlements in North America come a little bit later. They're going to be 100 years later at least for sort of massive settlements. And so that's going to sort of change who it is that's settling where. The Spanish are going to be in Florida, as maybe you guys know, but a lot of other Europeans are going to arrive later, and they're going to be sort of further up. So places like New England, right, the East Coast, the Southeast, those are all going to be colonized later than the Caribbean. And they're sort of colonized in a different way. You're going to see more settler colonialism. So here you go. Here's a depiction of Jamestown, right? So people from France, England, the Dutch, Italians eventually, right? The British are going to show up and basically try to recreate their societies there in North America, in New England, right? And this is pretty different than the Spanish going to conquer and just get resources and get out of there. There's a lot of reasons for this. As we talked about last time, there's all these different transformations in Europe. So you have religious conflicts in Europe. You have all these little independent states fighting each other. You have those 30-year war. Lots of reasons that Europeans want to leave Europe. And when they do and they head towards North America, they're going to try to rebuild societies that are like Europe in North America. Literally, right, they call them New England, stuff like that, a little bit later. So one of the reasons you might do this is to get away from persecution, right? I'm sure you guys all know the story of pilgrims being sort of persecuted in Europe and going to North America. It's not quite accurate, right? Pilgrims actually liked to persecute other people, and they had been kicked out of everywhere because they were sort of too extreme. So they wanted an opportunity to go to the US and be extreme kind of all on their own. But you might also go for the fur trade, as we're going to see a lot of Russians go to North America for the fur trade. A lot of Dutch and British do the same thing. Also, you might go to grow cash crops. Basically, a cash crop is not something you grow to eat. It's something you grow to sell. So instead of growing corn because you're going to take that corn and eat it all year long, you might grow tobacco. You're not going to eat the tobacco. In fact, you're not even going to smoke it, or not that much of it. But you can grow a lot of it, you can sell a lot of it, and then you can use that to buy food and buy the other things you need. Tobacco is going to be a big one. Rice is going to be a big one here in Georgia, right? All kinds of stuff like that. And these settlements are going to come with a new form of indentured labor and slavery. So we'll see both of those things happening, sort of combining those two different systems, somewhat along racial lines, but other characteristics as well. So out of these sort of initial contacts and sort of peopling of the Americas by Europeans and Africans, and de-peopling of the Americas in terms of the people that were there before European contact, you get all kinds of new multicultural societies with radically interesting, just mixed up groups of folks that have to suddenly work out who's what. So the Spanish come over to Mexico, for example, and naturally, pretty quickly, there's people that one of their parents is Spanish and one is not. So how do you call these people? Or what if you're Spanish, but you were born in the Americas? Like, are you different somehow? According to the sort of Spanish system, yes. The Spanish sort of racial system works really different than the American racial system we have today. You might think of it as mestizo society. All the categories were really fluid and moved around a lot. There were peninsulares. That means you were born in either Spain or Portugal, right? You're from like the peninsula back in Europe. There were Creoles, and if you're hip to Beyonce, this is not that kind of Creole, or if you're hip to like Louisiana, it's not that kind of Creole either. Creoles were Spanish or Portuguese people that happened to be born in the Americas. They're basically peninsulares, but they're not quite as good because they weren't born there. They're different. But so different race. So this is really weird, right? Because the Spanish meaning, if you were Spanish, you were peninsulare, and you were in the Caribbean and you had a child, that child was not the same race as you. That child was now a Creole, right? Kind of different. Mestizo is a different category, meaning a Spanish or Portuguese father, typically, and then a native woman, either from the Caribbean or from Mexico or South America. Mulattoes were mixes of like native women and black men, typically, although that, again, there's room there. There's all kinds of different stuff like this. Or actually, no, that's not right. Mulattoes were mixes of Spanish and Portuguese men, typically, and black women. Zombos were mixes of usually these new sort of categories that the Spanish were inventing, where there were like slave men or black men with Mexican women, would be Zombo, stuff like that. So there's all these sort of different categories, and we're going to see later. The Spanish get like really, really rigorous about this. They make charts, they make pictures, and there's like dozens of different categories. But the thing that's really weird is, depending on how your family is structured, you will be a different race than your parents, almost every time. If two peninsulares have a kid and they're in Spain, sure, that kid's going to be a peninsulare. But if they have that kid in Mexico, it's a Creole. If the Creole has a kid with the native woman, that kid is mestizo, right? So it's just like the categories keep changing. It's really different than how we view race today. In North America, it works a little bit differently. There's a lot of sort of plurality to racial structure in the US today, and in North America there was as well earlier on, but it's sort of more rigid. People don't change race based on where they're born or mixing as much, and slowly you start to get this formation of being white versus like other people, in particular versus Native Americans, but also against black folks, right? People are slowly coming to be described as white, which is kind of weird. Initially, they see themselves very much as British, Irish, French, German, Dutch, whatever. Over a couple hundred years, though, it sort of transforms, and people identify more as a sort of racial category than some sort of like ethnic category. And that new racial category that emerges in North America is white. We'll talk more about that later. It's also very strange. And these sort of transformations of racial categories, ethnic categories, families, lead to all kinds of mixing and blending of food, language, religion, economic practices, all this sort of stuff that goes with ethnicity or race, or that we attribute to ethnicity and race, that we sometimes just call culture, things like that. So like in this painting, this is called a casta painting. This is a Spanish painting that's supposed to be identifying different racial groups. So here you have a black man, a mestizo woman, and then their kid. And so you got to have like categories for all these sorts of things if you're Spanish, like who are all these people? And we're going to see how that works out a little bit later. At the same time that there is complex and sort of funky categories of race in the Americas, you also get a whole new spectrum of behavior and roles for women. Here you go. Here's the old coat of arms for Virginia. You'll notice there's a woman being guarded by two female knights, and then you have Virginia there. It was called Virginia because it was a virgin territory, right, in the eyes of the people who colonized it, the British who colonized it. They looked around and they were like, ooh, there's nothing here. But you step back a minute, there were a bunch of people there that they're going to be in conflict with, first of all, and part of the reason it was depopulated was already from disease. from earlier connections in the Americas. Anywho, men are going to constitute the majority of Spanish and Portuguese for sure. So when you look to the Caribbean, or when you look to Mexico, or when you look to South America, a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese are primarily men. They're workers, they're adventurers, explorers, stuff like this. And so you see a lot of mixing between people. These men don't bring their wives with them. They don't bring their families with them. So over 20 years, they're going to have families in Mexico. They're going to have families in the Caribbean. And it's much more normalized. In North America, migration's coming a little bit later. And a lot of times in North America, people do bring their whole family. People bring their kids. People bring their wives. And so you get a lot less mixing directly in a certain way, because it's just not necessarily required for society to function. So in the sort of northern context, in New England and the East Coast and stuff like this, you see a lot more sort of hardening of these sorts of roles for women, and which women it's okay to have sex with and all this sort of stuff, right? But even though it's not necessarily always part of the story, women are everywhere in the colonization of America. You have elite women, you have native women, colonizers, collaborators, like Malinche, right, was a woman that was already there in Mexico that sort of helped the Spanish, for example. You have poor women, rich women, slaves. Here's a painting of like native folks and white women working together. A lot of indentured labor. Sort of had stuff like this go on, where you would have had white women working with native men and stuff like this for a while, until it becomes more sort of taboo and like hardened against that later. Initially, roles for women were really, really diverse in the Americas, just because it was so different. It was like a funky new type of society where there was lots of sort of complex stuff going on. So aside from the sort of conquests and the mixing of people, there's something else that happens. Some people refer to as like the microbial unification of the world or something. Some people call it the Columbian Exchange. That's pretty good. Basically, it's all the exchanges between Afroeurasia and the Americas. And it's going to exchange tons of disease, reservoirs, food, all kinds of stuff around the world. For example, we might define it as a sort of large-scale exchange: plants, animals, disease, technology, people, ideas, everything between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia. This seems like a really simple concept, but it has incredible implications that just radically changed the world. These two hemispheres had evolved separately for at least 10 or 12,000 years, but probably longer. There had been contact between them, but not large scale, not prolonged, right? So we already looked at that. So between Polynesians and South Americans, or Vikings and native folks up in what today is like Canada or New England. But the Columbian Exchange, you start to see just radical reconnections and sort of realignments of where things exist around the world. For example, one of the most common sort of effects of this exchange is the transfer of disease from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. Now, this is not to say there were no diseases in America before, or they didn't know about disease. If you hear somebody saying that, that's garbage. Of course they did. Human beings have always had some sort of parasites, disease, headaches, all that, whatever. That's very common. But there was a whole sort of suite of diseases that had developed in Europe that people in the Americas had no resistance to or had never experienced. Smallpox, measles, typhoid, typhus, cholera, diphtheria, the plague, right? You name it, there's all kinds of stuff. Just basic influenza, the flu, right? Malaria from West Africa, right? All these sorts of diseases, yellow fever, right? Again, it's coming from West Africa. When they made it over to the Americas, there was no immunity to these things. They had never heard of them. They had no traditional healing apparatus, right, in place to deal with these diseases. Here's a drawing made by Aztec folks that symbolize what happened there. you see the sort of stuff coming out of the person's mouth that's supposed to be speaking, right? In these ones. So someone is sick and they're being talked to by a healer, and it's sort of a diagram of them going through the phases of the disease. It's probably smallpox, which was one of the ones that's most responsible for death in the Americas. So it was absolutely devastating. It's really hard to even envision how destructive it was. Maybe 80 to 95% of people in the Americas die from disease within about 100 and 150 years. There's some wiggle room on this. Some people claim that sort of indigenous slavery killed more, or that war killed a little bit more. But the vast majority of deaths was from disease in the sort of new conflicts. And I'll show you in a second like what that looks like for the population of Mexico and stuff like that. And there's a lot of questions about why this happened. It wasn't purposeful, right? Nobody at the time knew anything about disease in terms of what it was caused by, microbes, bacteria, stuff like that, viruses. That wasn't knowledge humans had yet. But one theory is that native folks in the Americas really hadn't domesticated as many animals. So they had domesticated dogs, they had domesticated turkeys down there in Mexico, right? That's where those are coming from. And alpaca, llama, stuff like that. But not nearly to the scale that people in Afroeurasia had: cows, pigs, chickens, ducks, all these sorts of things. Dogs, of course. So one theory is that by domesticating these large animals and living with them, human beings in Afroeurasia had been sort of sharing a lot of disease pools with these animals for a long time, and that created a certain type of immunity. Another theory is a few hundred years before this, the Black Death swept across Asia and Europe, right? And what today is like Southwest Asia, a little bit, North Africa. And the idea is anyone who was kind of weak or had genetic predisposition to suffer intensely from diseases was simply killed off. So that third of Europe that died were the ones that were kind of weaker. So the Europeans that were left had like a hardier sort of immune system or something like that. All of this could be true. In any event, the destruction is just absolutely devastating. And so you might wonder, well, was there any disease in the Americas that went back to Afroeurasia? And it's possible. The only one that's sort of most maybe people think is syphilis. Right, went back. Spanish and Portuguese got to the Caribbean and maybe Mexico and raped people essentially, and caught STDs and then took those back with them maybe to Europe. That's possible. Some people think that syphilis was kind of already around and it was just evolving on its own anyway. Another strange disease that briefly appears was called like the English sweats. And some English folks that made it to the Caribbean or maybe to North America afterwards would really quickly have this like weird like sweating bouts. They would really intensely, many of them died. But it's unclear what that disease was. It hasn't really been traced. So we don't know what that was from. But by and large, people in the Americas just seem to have less communicable diseases. So they were wiped out before they could really disseminate those to Europeans, or maybe Europeans did have stronger immune systems at the time because of these other complex sort of factors. It's really hard to know. Along with disease, Europeans and Africans brought some stuff with them that would make the issue worse. One of the things they brought were a lot of animals that carry and transmit disease. So we often call these reservoirs. So these little cuties right here, my reservoir dogs, these are prairie dogs, they can have the bubonic plague living inside them, and it doesn't hurt them at all. They're not going to die from it necessarily. Some people can live with the disease without being sick from it, but they can still spread it. Some animals are completely unaffected by a disease that inhabits them. What's another good example? I guess like lots of lizards, right? In their mouths, they have all kinds of crazy bacteria. If they bite you, you can get really sick, but it doesn't really matter to them at all. Stuff like that. Vultures, right, can eat anything, and that there's eating like rotten stuff. it doesn't really matter. All that disease the diseased meat they're eating and stuff doesn't make them sick. So there's other stuff like this that happens. So a lot of these domestic animals that people are bringing to the Americas either can be sick themselves or can act as reservoirs for these diseases. And so, for example, the Spanish flu, some people think that the pigs that were originally brought over by the Spanish could serve as reservoirs for that disease, helped bring that to the Americas. But there's lots of others as well, in particular, mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are a little bit different. They're not necessarily a reservoir, but they're more like vectors. So vectors are a little bit different. A reservoir is just an animal or a person or something that can hold the disease, and then if it's airborne and they sneeze on you, right, you can get it or something like that. In that case, the vector, like the way it's transmitted, is through the air. With mosquitoes, there's a lot of diseases that they're transmitted from person to person, but they need something in between, like malaria. I could be hanging out with someone with malaria all day. There's no chance I can get it from them, shaking hands, whatever, you can't get it. But if a mosquito bites that person and then bites me, I can get it. So there's something like in between that helps it transmit. And it's often mosquitoes or there's other vectors, fleas, for example. But these little ugly guys here are two different types of mosquitoes that Europeans and Africans bring with them. There's the Egypti and Anopheles mosquito there. And both of them, just the way their bodies are set up, they're a little bit more likely to transmit disease, in particular malaria and yellow jack fever, which were totally new, right, to people in the Americas. So the way this works is the mosquito jabs you, it drinks a little bit of your blood, but some of your blood is still left on its face and sort of in its like inner tracks here. When it bites someone else, there's a little moment where some of that blood and bacteria that's developing there can go into the other person, and that's how the disease can get transmitted. All right, so there was a little creepy example of how that works, right? The mosquito really close up, it bites you, it sucks out your blood, flies onto someone else. Can be a really big problem. And the way these diseases, particularly mosquito-borne diseases, work out is uneven over time. At first, diseases from Afroeurasia are incredibly destructive to native folks. So the Europeans bring them with them. They land in the Caribbean, they land in Mexico, South America, New England. They bring these diseases and they just decimate native populations. But then those diseases become endemic to the region. Malaria in particular, but yellow jack fever, stuff like this. Because there's mosquitoes living in the region now, those diseases are just there all the time. So then what happens later in the 1600s and 1700s is European colonizers and settlers show up. And when they do, they get absolutely decimated by these diseases because they're not used to them either. So you have people from, say, England that really have never had to experience tropical diseases, but then they show up And those diseases are now in the Caribbean because they were brought there by previous explorers or traders. So early on in European settlement, it's actually incredibly destructive for them too. Then later, we're going to see mosquitoes and other diseases actually help native folks and local folks fight off colonization in a very strange kind of twist. Washington knows about where the mosquitoes are in the Americas, and he has the British kind of camp there. Or in the Haitian Revolution, we're going to see the Haitians really cleverly lure the French into an area that's really dense with mosquitoes, and a lot of them get sick. So it's really kind of strange and uneven what happens. And it can wipe out whole colonies of European settlers. For example, you might not have ever heard of Darien. The Scottish tried to colonize their own little section of the New World, right there where Panama kind of connects into South America. So thousands and thousands of Scottish folks went there and tried to essentially make a colony. And things were going kind of okay until 1698-99. During the rainy season, there's tons and tons of mosquitoes. All these mosquitoes start biting the Scottish people. These Scottish people, they're not used to that. They're not used to tropical diseases. They're not used to dealing with the heat. They're not used to dealing with the water. And in particular, these diseases just devastate them during the rainy season. As many as 300 colonists are dying a day from diseases that are transmitted primarily via these mosquitoes that were originally brought to the area by Europeans in the first place. So it all kind of circles around the disease situation is pretty horrible for everyone. It's just kind of depending on when you cut into it, who's being affected. So this Columbian Exchange and these conquests, these sort of really large scale and fairly quick exchanges of plants and animals around the world and people around the world alter all kinds of stuff that we think of as culture or that we think of as being part of our life today, how we eat, demographics, all these sorts of things. Again, it seems like a really simple idea, but it's not so much. Here you go. There's a painting of allegedly the first Thanksgiving. It's kind of inverted. You have some nice white lady giving a Native American guy some food. Of course, that's the complete opposite of what happened, right? Even if you know the basic story. Native Americans saved those white people by giving them food, but hey man, when you paint the picture, you can have it however you want, I guess. So okay, here's an example that might kind of help you think about what's going on here. So there had been all these agricultural products developed in Afroeurasia, lots of them in North and South America as well. In both places, there were independent farming communities. People had figured out how to farm these things on their own. So in Europe and Africa and Asia, people had, learned how to farm and raise things like bananas, cows, chickens, grapes, horses, onions, pigs, rice, wheat, sugar, right? All of this sort of stuff comes from Afroeurasia, and people in the Americas had never seen any of it. On the other hand, in the Americas, there were lots of things like beans, tomatoes, corn, potatoes, different types of sweet potato, pumpkins, squash, all this sort of things. Turkeys, right, are one of the only domesticated sort of food animal. All of those things, peppers, tomatoes, right? I don't know if I said that one already. Those were all being farmed across the Americas, and Europeans had never seen any of them at all. So these things start to change back and forth. And this is really weird because we think of these things as just being food that exist. But before about 1500, nobody in the Americas had ever seen a cow. They didn't eat any beef. Nobody in Europe had ever seen a turkey, right? So these things kind of move around, and it has a lot of weird results. For example, here's a painting by one of the Dutch masters here. It's a group of people, European people, poor people, sitting around a table after a hard day of work, and they're all eating potatoes. Well, that's weird though, right? Because potatoes come from South America, Peru, that area, Chile, that area, the mountains. And Europeans had never seen them before. It was only fairly recently. But now potatoes are like seen as European as can be, right? French fries were invented in and Belgium. It's like the ultimate potato, right? So this is kind of confusing because a lot of things we think of as being really old or having always been that way are pretty darn new. A lot of the American crops came to be transferred to Afroeurasia and really changed the way people eat every day. So here on the left, you see lots of different types of potatoes. You could call these like heirloom varieties or original varieties or something like that. If you go to South America today, there's just like hundreds of different types of potatoes. They don't necessarily mass produce one type of potato like we do, like the russet or something like that. So you have all of these American crops that are going to get transferred to Afroeurasia, and they're going to provide lots of new calories in places where there weren't calories before. The good thing about potatoes is you can grow them on the side of a mountain. You can grow them in kind of crappy soil. They grow at high elevations. They grow close to the ocean. So potatoes are really important sort of calorie-wise. But you also get all kinds of new flavors. So here you go. Here's a bunch of different peppers and chilies. You got, I don't know, red bell peppers there. You got some jalapenos. I don't know what the English word is for those peppers in the back that look like a rattle, right, in Spanish. But these add to cuisine, right? These add to culture. People think of Thai food and they think spicy. People think of West African food and they think about like the peppers and stuff. Those people had never seen peppers, right? Those came from Mexico. That's where they had originally been grown by people. So we think of, or like Italian food, right? Having tomato sauce. They had never seen tomatoes. So it's really weird because there's this new mixing of food that we strongly associate with culture, but hadn't been true before. At the same time, there's a lot of crops that are grown in Afro-Eurasia already that get sent over to the Americas to be mass produced on plantations by the Portuguese in Brazil, like in those Engenho plantations. But then later, particularly in North America, in the South, in plantations, we're going to see like rice and sugar and stuff like that. So here on the left, you have sugar. Those are big, like bamboo canes that are, you know, like as thick as my arm, basically. They come in different colors and sizes and stuff. And then on the right, you have coffee. Coffee was originally from the area around Ethiopia, but also there was a slightly different variety from West Africa. That's why there's two different types of coffee. There's Arabica, that's the one from around Ethiopia, and then there's Robusta, that's the one from around West Africa. Anyway, Europeans are going to really quickly set up these sorts of plantations to grow sugar and coffee in the Americas and then ship them back over to the to European markets. But this leads to all kinds of weird sort of farming possibilities and the way people use crops. Here on the left, you have an image of a lady in southern China drying tons and tons of corn. If you've ever been to China, they don't really eat a lot of stuff made out of corn. So what's this lady doing? It's not like she's going to make a ton of masa and make like tortillas or something. This is all food for animals, right? So this allows them to grow tons and tons of food to feed the pigs, to feed the cows later. So they're growing this as a fodder, right, as like food for animals. On the right, this is in Colombia. Colombia is very famous for one particular crop. If you're thinking cocaine, that's not it. I mean, they're famous for that too, but mostly they're famous for coffee. So these are all coffee plants. One of the biggest exports out of Colombia, right, is all the coffee. So there had never been any coffee there before, but it turned out to be just an amazing region for growing coffee. So now there's a large chunk of Colombia's economy that runs on coffee to be shipped to the United States, to be shipped to Europe, shipped to Mexico. So all these new sort of opportunities for where you can grow things and how you can connect to a global sort of commodities market changed. Nobody in Colombia had ever thought, or nobody in this region of South America had ever thought that they were going to grow something that would then be shipped around the world or something. It was just all brand new, right? A new sort of mix of how you did things. There were also lots and lots of non-edible plants, particularly coming out of the Americas, such as rubber. You might be familiar with that. You know, you get it from a tree. Up until basically World War II, it's the primary sort of substance that you make. Anything today that's made out of plastic would have been made out of rubber. On the left there, you have tobacco plants. You guys probably already know about those big green leaves, right? Native Americans used to not really smoke that much tobacco. Some did, but a lot of times the green leaves were kind of pulverized and reduced down, and you got this like liquid out of them, and you drink that, and it's slightly hallucinogenic. Chicona bark is like what you make quinine out of, which was it's a drug that helps with malaria, right? So other stuff like that. There were a lot of non-edible plants that the Spanish and Portuguese and later the English are going to figure out have medicinal properties or have some sort of property where you can sell them or that make commodities, right, that people really like. So there's lots and lots of exchanges of these sorts of things. A lot of people are exchanged as well, primarily from Afroeurasia to the Americas. There is some transportation of Americans back to Europe or Africa or something, but not very much. By and large, you get a system of free and sort of semi-free migration coming out of Europe. Now what this means is some people choose to leave and some people are in debt or kind of forced to go or pushed out because of war or something like that. That's more like semi-free. Also, you have indentured servants. So here you see this picture. These are Portuguese men. They're probably choosing to migrate, right? They're looking for their adventure. They're looking for money, something like that. Here you have indentured servants. These are women that have been imported to Virginia. They literally ran like ads to get women to come to the Americas because they just didn't have enough on the East Coast, right? And so you would get these ads essentially are like promotions for women to come to like marry a man in Virginia or Georgia or something like that. Some of these would have been indentured servants if you couldn't afford passage or if you had a lot of debts. You could essentially sign a contract to act similarly to slave labor for a brief period of time. Not slavery, though, quite different. We'll get to some of that later when we look at transatlantic slavery. Here you have indentured servants working on like a field, you know, picking tobacco, stuff like that. But then you also have slavery, which was another form of migration, sometimes called, but completely unfree, and still a large transfer of people from one area of the world to another, creating a whole new diaspora. This is the reason people in the Caribbean, if you just go to any Caribbean country and look around, they're probably not Native American looking, they're probably not white. It's because the demographics were completely changed by this process. And we're going to see a lot more about this the next, I think, two videos we're talking about transatlantic slavery, so we'll get a sense of what was going on here. But removed from the sort of moral implications and the economic implications, just the sort of movement of people is absolutely incredible. It's millions of people being relocated, and what effect that has on locations and geographies around the world is really staggering, and we'll get a sense of that as well. Here's something you might relate to or might be more interested in. All of these exchanges totally change food culture around the world. Here's some of my favorite foods. Here's some good stuff going on. In that top left corner, I lived in Thailand for a long time. I did my dissertation there and stuff like that. This is my favorite meal, kapat kaprao. It's basically just like stir-fried chicken and chilies and a bunch of basil, and then you eat it with a fried egg on top of rice, and it's just amazing, right? Up in the center here, over there a little bit, you got some, looks like carne asada type tacos with some fresh salsa on it. You know, that looks pretty nice. Over here on the top, you got some kimchi, right? That's a Korean dish, fermented cabbage and chili paste. Over here, over there, like further away, you have bruschetta, right, which is Italian. It's tomatoes and a mix on top of like crostini or toasty little bread. And right next to me, well, I guess I don't know where I'm going to move this video, but down here, somewhere over here, You have West African type food, a stew, some sort of chicken stew here with like plantains and fufu. If you don't know fufu, yeah, you're missing out. Or maybe you do. Actually, a lot of students I talk to don't like it if they've had it. It's like a sticky, it's kind of like mashed potatoes, but it's not made from a potato. It's made from cassava. Um, it's basically like a flour that you mix in a little bit of water and you get this kind of like slightly stretchy, really starchy base that then you can use to eat your stew with and stuff. I dig it, but yeah, a lot of people don't like it that much. So what's weird about all of this stuff is none of it existed before these exchanges. It wouldn't even be possible. When you think about Thai food, you think about like chilies and stuff like that. Um, well, all of those chilies came from Mexico, right? No Thai person had ever eaten a chili before maybe 1550 or something like that. Or in Mexico there, right? That's carne asada. Those are wheat tortillas. It could be white corn, but probably wheat. The Mexicans had never seen wheat. Also, that beef, Mexicans had never seen beef. So of course that's their model, right, of making tortilla and making salsa and stuff. But with European foods, things that were being brought over from Europe, kimchi is the same sort of story, right? It's seen as like the most Korean dish possible. It's like quintessential. Every Korean family has their own recipe and stuff like this, but it's made with pepper flakes, right? That they wouldn't have had before, right? That was relatively new. The Italian food has tomatoes in it. Tomatoes come from Mexico. If you think of, yeah, like red sauce, spaghetti, pizza, all that sort of stuff, no Italian had ever even thought of any of that sort of thing. In fact, at first, Italians and other Europeans thought tomatoes would be really dangerous because they were part of the nightshade family, and they thought maybe they were poisonous. Also, that was associated with, native folks and stuff, and so that they thought that food was dangerous at first. The same thing goes in West Africa. So here you have this like really traditional chicken stew with plantains, but fufu is cassava root, and the cassava comes from South America. So they had never eaten this stuff in West Africa before maybe 1500, 1550 as well. But now it's like the starch. It's like the go-to starch in most of West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in some places. Um, so a lot of these sorts of foods we think of as traditional or like some race or some people or some culture made them, but it's all made up pretty recently. Definitely in the last 400 or 500 years, all of these things really transitioned. They wouldn't have been that way before. So a lot of new sort of changes develop, particularly in food. It's just a really easy way to show it. But there's other stuff going on too. It's really complex. A lot of Afro-Eurasians are going to settle in the Americas, and they're going to pick up on stuff that native folks are doing that works. So here you have a couple of sort of like imagined depictions of native folks before the arrival of Europeans and Africans, and you can see some of the things that come out of it. For example, this lady smoking a pipe. Well, people didn't smoke pipes in Europe or Africa or Asia before this, right? Because, at least not tobacco, because it comes from the Americas. So like if you know like old like American cartoons or something like a corncob pipe, well, all you have to do is think about it for a second. Where did that come from? Of course, it came from Native Americans, but it's seen as like old-timey American or something, old-timey U.S. You have that guy barbecuing, right? The technique of cooking over smoke using like hickory or mesquite or something like this, that's from Taino people, right? That the word barbecue comes from Taino people. Obviously using chilies, right? I mean, people think of barbecue as like, oh, it's Memphis or North Carolina or I don't know, Texas or wherever. I'm sure I left somebody out and they're going to be upset. Who did I leave out? North Carolina, Memphis. Oh, Kansas City, maybe, I guess. Yeah, okay. So there's different types of barbecue, right? But it all comes from Native Americans, which is really weird because it's definitely seen as like a very like, USA kind of thing. Or if you look at this image on the left, these sort of A-frame houses with a chimney in the center on top of like a mound. Actually, that's how a lot of Native Americans built houses. That's the style that New Englanders are going to build their houses in. And that's different. In Europe, most people were building out of brick, but they didn't really have brick. You weren't going to bring a bunch of brick with you on the ship. They didn't have brick factories yet. So that sort of A-frame house with this sort of fortification around the outside, up on hills and these sorts of things, that comes straight from what native peoples were doing in the Americas as well. So you see a lot of sort of crossover there, new practices being developed, sometimes to the point where people forget where they came from. And they just assume, oh, those little like European style cottages. And it's like, well, no, those were Native American style cottages, right? Europeans just like adapted them and made them their own. Also, we talked a little bit about population. And so here's some graphs about how this is going to work. Basically, at this time, all of these new changes are going to make lots and lots of new people in Europe and Asia. All of this new food, all of these new commodities coming out of the Americas are primarily going to benefit people in Europe and Asia. So here on the left, you have a chart of urbanization in some cities, Madrid, Paris, and London. And you can see like Paris and London, like the population goes through the roof. Madrid, the population like triples. So a lot of these resources over 100 years coming out of the New World drain right into Europe. And this allows cities to get bigger. This allows more food in European cities, right? Then you can have more people, all that sort of stuff. But if you look at this graph of population in Mexico on the other side, you can see that in about, what's that, like less than 70 years, right? 75 years, 65 years, the population when Europeans first start showing up, Cortez, right, going into Mexico, maybe around 25 million people in Mexico, what today is Mexico. But pretty quickly you see that number drop just horrendously. A lot of that's from disease, some of that's from colonization, some of that's from the wars. But you go in 30 years from, here, let me highlight this, this is really crazy. You go from 25 million down to like 5 million people in only 30 years. So that means 80% drop off, right? That's absolutely incredible and incredibly devastating. But that's not it. Then it continues, right? Until by the end of this graph here, going towards 1600, you're at maybe 2 million people, right, in Mexico. So you have this just incredibly destructive demographic change in the Americas, but actually a demographic boom in Afroeurasia. And that's problematic in lots of ways, in part because Afroeurasia already had so many more people. So there's tremendous, tremendous imbalance in the sort of results of these exchanges. They're lopsided and they're much more destructive for peoples in the Americas, for sure. So this sort of Columbian Exchange, this sort of conflict between the Spanish and the Portuguese and people in the Americas, these mass movements of people, they trigger absolutely profound transformations in the way the whole world interacts, global food supplies, the sort of ecology, culture, racial distinctions, class distinctions, in a way that it's never going to go back. Nobody today is going to give up chocolate in Europe, right? But chocolate came originally from Mexico. It's so intertwined. When you think of chocolate, if you go to like a grocery store, it's like Swiss chocolate and stuff, German chocolate. No one's going to be able to roll that back. You can't undo these changes. So the sort of implications are that the world has kind of come together in a new way, and you can't undo it. But that's just sort of the starting off point. You're going to need a lot of other changes coming down the line, and many of them are not great. So we'll see some of that kind of next time. So next time we'll start looking at transatlantic slavery, we'll talk about sugar, we'll talk about power, creolization, and we'll get started on that. We'll do that for a couple times. Make sure to read that Traditions and Encounters, and as always, let me know if you have any questions, give me an email, something like that. Otherwise, talk to you next time.